I wanted to talk some Alabama Crimson Tide recruiting today, especially with the Crimson Tide being listed in yet another top offensive tackles top 5. And even past that, I wanted to take a look at a few different prospects that I've been thinking about, and then talk about news that the NCAA is supposed to be meeting next week to vote on the one-time transfer rule, and we know what that means, but we have got to get into it. But before we do, as always, y'all know the drill. I want to hear from y'all. And today we're going to be talking about Chianti Goodwin's top 5, but we've also talked about 5-star offensive lineman Zach Rice, 5-star offensive lineman Josh Connerly Jr., and now Chianti Goodwin, all guys who have Alabama in their top lists. So the question is, do you believe that Alabama is able to land one or more of these guys? And if so, who do you think it is? I cannot wait to hear what y'all are thinking, because these are very talented players. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification, because I do constant college football content, player reviews, film analysis, talk style videos like this, and I'm on my push to 5,000 subscribers in my first year, and I would love to have you along for the journey because I have a lot of cool stuff planned. But with all that being said and out the way, let's talk first about Chianti Goodwin. Chianti Goodwin is one of the top tackles in all of high school football recruiting right now, and he is going to be a major piece to someone's recruiting class. Some college is going to be very lucky that he chooses to go there and play college football there, because he is a guy that looks to develop into something incredible. 6'7", 300 pounds, super athletic at that size. There's a reason why he's a high rated 4-star prospect, and he has a top 5 list of Alabama, Ohio State, Kentucky, Michigan State, and Clemson. And as it sits right now, Chianti Goodwin is expected to commit 1 week from tomorrow on Alabama's A-Day, April 17th. Crystal balls have been entered, and Kentucky looks to be the lead here. And if Kentucky can land a 6'7", 300-pound tackle of his stature and his acclimate in recruiting, that is going to be a massive victory for Kentucky. But as we know, teams such as Ohio State and Alabama and Clemson, they're not out of it until ink is on paper. So even if Chianti Goodwin next Saturday does end up committing to a Kentucky, know that the Crimson Tide will stay hot on his trail, and I still think the Crimson Tide are in a good position for him, because Doug Marrone is a guy that's been making a lot of waves. Surprisingly, I knew that he would be coming in and making a splash, but it's the way that he's been able to get guys interested in Bama who maybe previously weren't looking at them. Remember, I think the best example of this is 5-star offensive guard Devin Campbell, who released his top 12, I believe it was, and didn't feature Alabama. Maybe it was the top 16, but regardless, he dropped his top 12 or 16, and it didn't include Alabama. And this is when Kyle Flood was at Alabama recruiting, who just put together the greatest offensive line class of all time. In comes Doug Marrone. Devin Campbell releases his top 8, and there the Alabama Crimson Tide are, and Devin Campbell has been on record saying that he's very big on Doug Marrone. Now the question with Devin Campbell is, can the Crimson Tide make up the ground that has been lost because they weren't featured in his top 16 or 12? It's the Crimson Tide. We know they can, but Texas has a very interesting pitch, because they're pitching basically to him what Bama pitched to a lot of guys such as like Julio. Come, stay in your home state and be the guy that can really change the program of Texas, or be one of the guys that is the catalyst of change in the state of Texas. So Chianti Goodwin, Devin Campbell, 2 guys that the Crimson Tide are going to be hot after, 2 guys that the Crimson Tide are featured on their list. Right now, if we look at crystal balls, Devin Campbell's crystal ball to go to the University of Texas, Chianti Goodwin to Kentucky. However, it does not end there for Alabama Crimson Tide offensive line prospects. Remember, we just said that in the last class, Alabama signed possibly the greatest offensive line class of all time. Number 1 tackle in the nation, number 2 tackle in the nation, both guys top 10 players in the nation, number 1 center in the nation, number 2 guard in the nation. Absolutely bonkers. And even outside of Devin Campbell and Chianti Goodwin this year, they're still in the top lists for both Zach Rice and Josh Connerly Jr. Now, Josh Connerly Jr., I just did a video on. 6'5", incredibly athletic guy, super fast, and his footwork and violence at the point of attack are awesome. He's a guy that might end up going to guard at the college level, and if he does, he's going to be an immediate impact player, or he has the ability to, barring the possibility that your institution has a great player already in place at guard. but he's a guy that he could absolutely play tackle. Don't get the assumption that I'm limiting him, but when I think of how athletic he is and the ability to pull guards and do all of these cool things, man, Josh Connerly Jr. is a super enticing guy because I think he's a guy that's going to be pulling a lot. So he's a guy we need to keep an eye on. He just had Alabama in the top of his list, and if you didn't watch the video I did on Josh Connerly Jr., I'll link that down below. Be sure to go check that out. However, even then, 5-star offensive tackle Zach Rice is another individual who the Crimson Tide ended up on his top 5, and they're going to be pursuing Zach Rice very, very diligently. And now with the addition of Drew Svoboda for Alabama's special teams and tight ends coach, you have to wonder how that's going to affect the 5-star offensive tackle out of the Houston area, Banks, because Svoboda is from right down the road. So Alabama's stacking a bunch of Texas recruiters and guys from that area to see how it pays off dividends. Now, sticking in the Texas area, we do have news. Evan Stewart, a guy who y'all know I've been very high on, is now a 5-star. I've been saying this was going to happen for a long time now, and he's a guy that was committed to Texas, decommitted, and now is playing the field, and I think that this is an SEC lock on Evan Stewart. Texas is still being featured, but Texas's greatest pitch to him right now is Steve Sarkisian. Other than that, Evan Stewart, I think, is going to be going to the SEC. He's very high on Alabama right now because Alabama has become wide receiver U. Now, before we wind down and talk about this NCAA thing very briefly, I wanted to also keep in the Houston area and talk Harold Perkins, 5-star outside linebacker that 24/7 Sports comps to a Dylan Moses. Now, this is a guy that A&M is very, very in on right now. A&M is crystal ball to be the favorite there. They've done a phenomenal job, and A&M is hot on the trail of a lot of guys. He is someone we talked about that will be visiting the Oklahoma Sooners in September for a loaded weekend of recruiting. A lot of 5-stars going to be there. Amaria Bohr, Gentry Williams, Gabriel Brownlow Dindy, and Harold Perkins all headlining that event. Very, very awesome to see. But once again, with Svoboda coming into Alabama, I'm wondering how that's going to change the outlook for Alabama being able to land Harold Perkins, because he's a guy that the Crimson Tide will be clawing for till the very end. But finally, news from the NCAA that they may be meeting next week to vote on a one-time transfer rule. Now, according to a podcast I was listening to, Bama Online per 24/7 Sports, with Chris Hummer and Travis Rear, they were talking about that there's this kind of air that this one-time transfer rule passed by the NCAA will contain verbiage that supersedes conference rules. Right now, as it sits, the Big 12 has a rule where even if the NCAA grants a player a eligibility waiver, the Big 12 will not allow that, even with the NCAA's waiver being granted. So because of that, the thought process is that the NCAA one-time transfer rule would supersede all conference rules so that it is eligible across the board. It doesn't matter whether the Big 12 wants it to be eligible or not. It doesn't matter whether the ACC wants it or not. It is a blanket coverage statement, and because of that, the possibility of Henry To'oTo'o to Alabama looks very good if this gets done sooner rather than later, and if it's true that this supersedes the conference rule, because To'oTo'o is someone we believe wants to be at Alabama. It's just all turning out to be based on this rule. But I cannot wait to hear what y'all are thinking. First and foremost, where do you think the Crimson Tide sit in recruiting? Who are you looking forward to? Who did we talk about today that you're super intrigued by? And lastly, what do you think of the news with the NCAA? I cannot wait to hear from y'all. Hop down to the comments, let me know what you're thinking. And that's it. See ya.